Everyone thought he was fine. He had a job. He had friends. Life followed the plan. But inside, there was emptiness. This is the story of a man who lived on autopilot for too long, and one day realized he no longer felt alive. He woke up not because of an alarm, but because of the habit of waking up a minute before it. The room was dark, but not completely. The city left a blurred yellowish stain on the ceiling from the street lamp outside the window. It smelled of the radiator's dry heat and something metallic, the way old radiators smell when they start to warm. He lay still, listening to the quiet. The quiet in his apartment was always the same, a thin hum from the elevator shaft, the occasional click of pipes in the wall, a step on the landing that dissolved as quickly as it appeared. The alarm shivered on the nightstand, buzzed briefly. He turned it off in one motion, precise, without anger, the way you shut off an alarm system. For a second, he closed his eyes again, hoping to catch that state where he didn't yet have to be himself, didn't yet have to remember where he was going and why. But it didn't hold. Inside, the familiar dryness was already rising. The day had begun. In the bathroom, the light hit him straight in the face. He stared into the mirror without trying to study himself, more like checking for proof of existence. 38. A forehead almost without wrinkles, an even stubble, eyes tired, not from lack of sleep, but as if interest had been gone from them for a long time. He turned away, started the water. The shower was hot, but it felt as if his skin couldn't fully register it. He stood under the stream, letting the body do what it knew: wash, warm, live. It was strange how the body keeps going even when thoughts are like a TV that's been turned off. In the kitchen, everything was in its place. That too was a habit. Things stood where they had stood yesterday and a week ago. Order in small things created the illusion that order existed at all. He put the kettle on, took out a mug, the same one with a thin crack by the handle. The crack had appeared long ago, and he still hadn't thrown the mug away. It didn't get in the way. A lot of cracks don't, as long as you don't look at them. He made coffee automatically, barely noticing the smell. Though the smell was there, dark, thick, promising, but promising for someone else. He took a couple of sips, and the liquid simply went down, like medicine. His phone lay on the table, screen up. Notifications blinked as if his life contained many people and events. Work chat, another one. A message from a friend, a meme and a short lol. A meeting at noon in the calendar, and a workout in the evening. He replied to the meme with an emoji without reading to the end. His fingers did their thing, his brain did its own. That was his main ability, to split into parts. When people asked, "How are you?" he answered, "Fine." He said the word easily, even with a smile, and each time it felt like he stamped a seal. Question closed. He left the apartment, locked the door, checked the bolt twice, not from anxiety, but as a ritual. The stairwell smelled of dampness and other people's dinners. The elevator moved slowly, and every second he watched the numbers as if they might tell him how to live. Outside, the air was cold and wet. The sky was gray like plaster that hadn't dried. People flowed in streams, brushing shoulders, and no one noticed anyone. He walked with them on autopilot. Music in his ears, but at the lowest volume. He didn't like it when music became real. Real things could catch on him. In the subway, he stood by the door, holding the pole. The pole was cold, smooth, worn by thousands of hands. He looked at the ads above the windows without understanding the words. Sometimes his gaze snagged on his reflection in the dark glass, his face. Looked composed, even good, a man who copes. At work, that feeling only strengthened. He entered the office, greeted people, smiled. They respected him, trusted him. He was the one they described as always calm, always fine. It sounded like a compliment and like a sentence. The coffee machine hissed, dispensing identical drops of identical drink. Colleagues talked about weekends, plans, someone's relationship. He kept the conversation going, delivered the right lines, asked the right questions. He had a well-practiced ability to seem interested in a way that kept anyone from noticing he wasn't. At lunch, he went outside to walk. The wind tugged at his coat collar, and he raised it more out of habit than cold. He caught himself walking and unable to remember what he wanted. Not what he should do, that was clear enough. Work, pay, work out, see friends. But what he wanted, that word felt like it belonged to another life. A life where people had desires, not just schedules. In the evening, there was the workout. That was easier. The body worked, the mind shut down. The smell of rubber and metal, sweat, the thrum of music from the speakers. He saw people around him watching themselves in the mirrors, trying to become better. He watched too, but he didn't want to become better. He wanted not to feel. Sometimes, pressing the bar, he'd catch a short thought. If everything stopped right now, he wouldn't even be surprised. The thought wasn't frightening, it was tired, and that was what made it frightening. After the gym, he met friends. A bar, lights, glass, noise, everyone talking at once, interrupting, laughing. He laughed with them, hit the pauses, told stories. Sometimes he managed to be the person they knew. Sometimes he didn't, and then he simply acted. Once, a friend slapped his shoulder and said, "You're the most stable one of us. You're always steady." The others nodded. He smiled, but inside something slipped. They didn't know. And not even because he was hiding it. He couldn't explain what exactly was wrong. There was no specific disaster. There was absence. At home, he turned the TV on for background, ate something fast without looking at the food. Then he washed the plate, wiped the counter, did everything right. Then he stood at the sink and listened to the faucet drip, drip, pause, drip. That sound was the most honest thing in his apartment. At night he woke up, not from nightmares, from emptiness. He lay there staring into the dark, and the same thought came every time. He lived as if he didn't exist. Then he told himself, "You're just tired. Tomorrow will be easier." And he fell asleep. It went on like that for a long time, until that email. The email arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. The subject line was dry, official. He opened it between two calls, expecting another work document, and saw a name. The name of someone he hadn't heard about in years, but that still lived somewhere inside him like a scar. It was a death notice. Date, place, a few careful phrases. The words were correct, emotionless, but it felt as if a door had been opened in his chest into a cold basement. He read it again. Behind the glass wall of the conference room, someone laughed. In the corridor, a cleaning cart rattled. The office kept living. He sat there, unable to take a deep breath. It wasn't bad the way movies show it. He didn't collapse or scream. Something inside simply shifted, as if a support had been there and now it wasn't. He understood. Everything he'd built, this system, this control, didn't save him from what still happens, and didn't fill what was empty inside. He closed his laptop, stood up, went to his boss and said, "I need to leave, urgently." His boss looked at him more carefully than usual. "Everything okay?" He wanted to say the habitual yes, but couldn't. "No," he said, and surprised himself. Outside, a fine rain was falling. It was small, almost invisible, but within a minute he felt his collar getting wet. He didn't open an umbrella. He wanted that cold to be something real. He went to the funeral, even though he could have not gone. Could have told himself, "We haven't talked in years." Could have hidden inside his schedule. But this time, the schedule didn't save him. In the morning, the cemetery met him with dampness and the smell of wet earth. The trees stood black and bare, and the wind rustled through dry leaves that no one had cleared from the paths. He walked slowly, trying not to look into people's faces. People stood in little clusters, spoke quietly, each holding either an umbrella or a bouquet or a thermos, as if you could warm yourself and it would hurt less. He saw the coffin too early, and something in him seemed to say, "There it is," and then went silent. His mouth went dry. He swallowed, but there was no saliva. Nearby, someone sobbed, and that sound felt louder than any music. He stood under the canopy with everyone else. The priest's words passed him by, catching only as intonations. Here you must be silent. Here you must cross yourself. Here you must lower your eyes. He did everything right. Inside, he held on to one thought. This person had once seen him alive, seen him before he learned to be stable. When it was time to say goodbye, he stepped forward. The boards under his feet creaked. He leaned in, placed his hand on the lid. His fingers felt the cold varnish, the smooth surface with no warmth and no answer. He wanted to say something out loud, something simple and human, but he couldn't find words. The words people usually say about death felt foreign. He simply exhaled, as if releasing what he'd been holding. Then came the earth, the sound of earth hitting wood, dull, final. He flinched, though he tried not to show it. He suddenly felt embarrassed that his body still reacted, that he was still here. On the way back, he sat in the car and didn't start the engine for a long time. The wipers crawled slowly across the windshield, smearing the rain. He watched those streaks and thought, if someone asked him right now what he felt, he couldn't answer. Not because there were no feelings, because he hadn't named them in a long time. That evening, he called a friend, the kind of friend who knew how to be silent. "Can you today?" he asked. "Of course. Where are you?" They met in a small cafe. It smelled of coffee and wet jackets like it does everywhere in autumn. The friend listened without interrupting. Then he said, "You look like you're holding on by your fingernails." And that was frightening, because someone had seen the crack he thought was invisible. After the funeral, everything seemed to return to its usual rhythm: work, meetings, workouts. But inside, there was no longer the old certainty. He was as if he'd started hearing his own silence. It had grown louder. He began lingering outside more in the evenings, standing by the entrance, looking up at windows. In other apartments, there were dinners, conversations, TVs. Life was happening there. In his, no. He felt like someone who lived alongside life, but not inside it. He started sleeping worse. Food lost its taste. He could stare at one point and not notice an hour passing. He began forgetting small things, where he left his keys, what he wanted to say in a meeting. It irritated him because control was his last weapon, and the weapon was getting dull. The panic attack happened exactly where he'd always assumed he was safest, among people. They gathered at a restaurant for a birthday. The light was warm, candles everywhere, the murmur of voices, clinking glasses. A waiter darted between tables, trailing the smell of grilled meat and wine. His friends laughed, argued about something stupid. Someone showed vacation photos. He sat there, smiling, replying, acting as if he was listening. And then, as if someone turned the volume knob to the limit, every sound came too close. Laughter cut, plates rang, music from the speakers punched his chest. He noticed his fingers were gripping the fork too hard. The metal dug into his skin. He tried to inhale, and the air didn't go in the way it should. His chest tightened, like an elevator between floors. His heart hit harder, then again. He felt sweat bloom on his back, even though the room was cool. The pool of lamplight on the table wavered, as if he were looking through water. He told himself, "Pull it together." The words sounded dry inside, like an order. He tried to breathe again, and suddenly understood he couldn't, not completely, but enough that each breath became effort. A sticky emptiness formed in his throat. His palms went damp. He looked at the glass of water. The water trembled because his hands trembled. Someone nearby asked, "Why are you so quiet?" He tried to smile, but the smile didn't settle on his face. His cheeks seemed to have forgotten the movement. He felt that if he stayed, everything would collapse in front of everyone, and he wouldn't survive it. "I'll be right back," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. The restroom was bright and too white. The tiles reflected light. The mirror hit him in the face. It smelled of soap and bleach. He went into a stall, locked it, sat on the lid, elbows on his knees. The ventilation hummed evenly, as if it didn't care. He started counting breaths. 1, 2, 3. With each count, it felt like he was lying to himself. He controlled nothing. His heart kept racing. A thought flashed, "I'm going to die." And then another, softer, "Maybe that would be easier." He was scared of the second one. He pressed his palm to the cold stall wall. The cold was real, tangible. He clung to it like a pole in the subway. Gradually, his breathing lengthened. The sweat on his palms cooled. Inside, a tremor remained, like after severe cold. He came out to the sinks and turned on the water. It was icy. He held his wrists under the stream, then his face. Drops ran down his chin. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who would just nearly come apart and who would still go back and say, "I'm fine." He returned to the table. Someone joked. Someone raised a toast. He smiled, nodded, even took a sip. No one noticed anything. That was the worst part. He could be at the edge and still remain invisible. At home, he took off his jacket and tossed it onto a chair without hanging it up. That was almost a crime against his order. He stood in the hallway and felt his strength was gone. The phrase surfaced again, "Everyone thinks you're fine." And he suddenly realized he thought that too, because otherwise it was terrifying. A few days later, his mother called. She always called in the evening when her day's chores were done. "How are you?" she asked. He had already opened his mouth to say, "Fine," and suddenly felt he couldn't. "Tired," he said instead. There was silence on the line. Then she answered quietly, "You've been saying that for many years." After that conversation, he sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Outside, someone shut a car trunk. The sound echoed in the courtyard. He caught himself feeling envy. Someone had things to carry. At work, he made a mistake. Small, fixable, but his manager commented on it in front of everyone, calmly, businesslike, as it's done. He should have reacted calmly. He usually did. But this time, something inside shut off. He sat in the meeting and realized he couldn't speak. The words were there, but they wouldn't come out. The pause stretched. Colleagues glanced at each other. Someone asked, "Are you okay?" He looked at the table, at his hands, at the thin line on his finger from the pen, evidence he'd been gripping it too hard all day. And he said, "No." The word came out quietly, but the room grew even quieter, as if everyone muted the sound at once. He expected judgment, awkward advice, questions, but the manager simply stood and said, "Come on, let's step out." In the corridor, it smelled of coffee, printers, and something overheated, the way machinery smells when it runs without stopping. They stopped by a window. Outside was the gray city, wet asphalt, people with umbrellas. He saw them like an image on a screen, distant and uniform. "What's going on?" the manager asked. He wanted to answer neatly, just tired. He wanted to hide again, but his throat tightened. "I can't cope," he said. The words came uncertainly, as if he were saying them out loud for the first time. Not having to explain immediately, not having to justify, this was unfamiliar. He went on, I've been living on autopilot for a long time. Everything looks fine, work, friends, but inside it's empty, and I don't understand how to stop it." He expected the manager to say something about discipline or taking leave, but he looked at him not like a boss, but like a person. "I'm not a psychologist," he said, "but it sounds like burnout or something deeper. You need a specialist. And let's do this. We'll lighten your load. Take a couple of days, a week. I'll cover things." Shame flared instantly, like a flash, as if he'd been caught being weak. He nodded. He tried to say thank you, but only managed, "Okay." That same evening, he spent a long time choosing a therapist. It felt like buying medicine, reading, comparing, checking, distrusting. He found a time, booked it, and immediately wanted to cancel. His finger hovered over the button. He sat on the couch, heard a neighbor's door slam in the hallway, heard the elevator go down. Inside was the feeling of standing at the edge of something unknown. He didn't cancel. The first session was awkward. He spoke evenly, like giving a report. The therapist listened and asked short questions. At one point they asked, "When was the last time you rested?" He opened his mouth and froze. He could name a vacation, a couple of weekends, workouts, but none of it was rest. It was escape. "I don't know," he said honestly. The therapist nodded as if not knowing was normal. "And when was the last time you felt alive?" He smiled automatically to hide, then understood the smile didn't fit and let it drop. "A long time ago," he said. "I don't remember." After the session, he went outside. The air was frosty and clear. It stung his nostrils. He walked and didn't turn on music. The silence in his headphones felt strange, but honest. At home, he turned on the kitchen light and sat down. The light was yellow, soft. He stared at the countertop and suddenly began to cry, quietly, without sobbing. Tears came on their own, as if the body had finally found an outlet for what he'd held for years. It was the point after which he could no longer pretend everything was fine. In the days after that night in the restaurant, he began to fear not people, but the moment the glitch might happen again. He noticed his body in small things, the way it tensed entering an elevator, the way his fingers searched for his phone, the way his breath shortened when someone looked a second too long. He noticed he started choosing seats near the exit everywhere, meeting rooms, subway cars, theaters, not because he planned to run, but because the thought of being able to run calmed him. He kept going to work, and outwardly everything looked the same: coffee, meetings, numbers, smiles. But now he heard his inner monologue more clearly than before, as if someone had put it on a microphone. "You didn't sleep again. Don't be weird. Don't pause. Answer immediately. Smile, or they'll notice." The phrases weren't mean or aggressive. They were businesslike, like a to-do list. That was what was frightening. He was his own manager, and that manager never took a vacation. One morning, he paused at the mirror longer than usual. There was no tragedy on his face, not even pain. Something flat, dehydrated. He tried to make a smile. It worked. He tried to make a no-smile face, and suddenly realized even that face didn't feel like his, like a mask he'd taken off without knowing what was underneath. He left home earlier than he needed to. Outside it was still dim, streetlights were on, and the snow beneath them looked bluish. By the entrance, a janitor was clearing the path. The shovel scraped the asphalt with a sharp, brisk sound. The man glanced up and said the usual, "Morning." He replied and suddenly felt warmth, not from the word, but from the fact. Someone saw him and simply greeted him, expecting nothing. In the subway, he took off his headphones for the first time. Without music, the city sounded different. The screech of brakes, coughing, a brief laugh, the rustle of plastic bags. And in that noise, there was something real, not his personal tragedy, just life happening nearby. He caught himself listening to a child in the next seat whispering something important to his mother, and that whisper, for some reason, moved him. At work, someone asked again, "How are you?" And again he wanted to say, "Fine." His tongue was already lifting, the word almost formed, but he paused. The pause was only a second, but inside it was a chasm. "Honestly, it varies," he said instead. "I've been getting hit by stuff lately." The colleague blinked, as if not expecting that answer, and immediately asked, "Want coffee, or do you want to sip for 5 minutes?" He said coffee because sit sounded too close, but the fact of the offer stayed in his mind like a warm pebble in a pocket. At lunch, he went outside, bought soup at a small place near the office, and sat not at his usual table but by the window. Snow was falling beyond the glass. A few cars moved slowly as if they weren't in a rush. He ate slowly and for the first time noticed taste, not bright but present. Salty broth, a hint of garlic, bread warm and soft. It was ridiculous. He was suddenly glad about soup, but the gladness was quiet and honest. A few days later, he went to the second session. On the way, he caught himself wanting to invent a correct story, to look like a reasonable patient, as if even here he had to be a good employee. The office was warm, the light didn't cut his eyes, and on the windowsill was a mug of pencils, and that detail calmed him. Perfection wasn't demanded here. "What changed since last time?" the therapist asked. He wanted to say nothing, then remembered the soup, the pause in conversation, the headphones he'd taken off. "I've started noticing," he answered. "What exactly?" He thought, body, smells, fears. He said, "I notice how I force myself." The therapist suggested something simple, not a practice, not a technique, but a tiny action. Every day write down one truth about himself, one sentence he usually didn't say out loud, not for a beautiful text, for fixation. That evening he opened his notes and stared at the blank screen for a long time. His fingers didn't want to type. Then he wrote, "I'm lonely." He saw the words and immediately wanted to delete them. They were too direct, almost shameful. He didn't delete them. He left them, closed the phone, and felt his hands tremble slightly. The next day he wrote, "I'm tired of pretending." Then, "I'm afraid no one will notice if I disappear." He wrote briefly, sometimes roughly. Sometimes the sentences were odd. "I miss myself." He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he felt it was true. One evening, he came home and found the hallway light bulb had burned out. Before, he would have changed it immediately because that's what you do. He took a new bulb from the closet, stood on a stool, screwed it in. The light came on, and he suddenly thought, it matters to him that it's bright because he doesn't want darkness. It was a tiny, domestic thing, but behind it was it closed the phone and felt his hands tremble slightly. The next day he wrote, "I'm tired of pretending." Then, "I'm afraid no one will notice if I disappear." He wrote briefly, sometimes roughly. Sometimes the sentences were odd. "I miss myself." He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he felt it was true. One evening, he came home and found the hallway light bulb had burned out. Before, he would have changed it immediately because that's what you do. He took a new bulb from the closet, stood on a stool, screwed it in. The light came on, and he suddenly thought, it matters to him that it's bright because he doesn't want darkness. It was a tiny, domestic thing, but behind it was a decision. Small as it was, he chose not to make things worse. He began, gradually, to say no. Not loudly, not as a statement. He simply stopped agreeing to extra things. When a colleague asked him to take another task for a couple of hours, he said honestly for the first time, "I can't. I'm already over capacity." And the world didn't collapse. The colleague shrugged and moved on. He sat there and felt something strange, freedom mixed with anxiety, as if he'd broken a rule no one remembered except him. Still, setbacks happened. One night he woke again, and the emptiness came like it used to, without warning. He lay there staring at the ceiling, hearing, "This won't get better. You're just like this." He got up, went to the kitchen, turned on the light. The cold floor was unpleasant, and that oddly grounded him. He wanted to text his friend, but immediately thought, "Why? He's asleep. You're a burden." He sat, wrapped his hands around a mug even though it was empty. For 10 minutes he just sat. Then he wrote anyway. "Can't sleep. No need to reply now," and sent it. He sent it and felt relief, as if he'd stopped holding a weight at arm's length. In the morning, the friend replied, "I'm here. Want to walk tonight?" He read the message several times. The words were simple, but they carried a promise. He didn't have to earn it. They met after work. It was cold. Streetlights were yellow. The snow underfoot had turned to slush. They walked along the embankment where the wind was stronger, and conversation sometimes broke because you had to draw breath. The friend talked about work, about some small household nuisance, and it was good. Not everything had to be about feelings. Sometimes support is being able to not talk about yourself every minute. At one point, he said himself, "That night, I thought I was having a heart attack." The friend looked at him without fear. "What did you do?" "I left, hid in the bathroom, sat there, breathed, and thought I couldn't do it." The friend nodded. "Then you did everything right. You survived." The word "survived" sounded strange, like they were talking about a war, but that was how it felt inside, as if each day was a small siege. They reached a small shop. The friend bought 2 bottles of water and handed one to him. The plastic was cold. Inside, the water sloshed softly. He took a sip and felt the cold pass down his throat, as if opening space there. "I don't know where all this is going," he said. "You don't have to know," the friend answered. "Today, you're just walking. That's enough." Then there was another scene that unexpectedly became a turning point, even though nothing dramatic happened. He went to see his mother on the weekend. He hadn't gone in a long time. He always found reasons: work, things to do, tired. This time he got on a bus that smelled of wet clothes and cheap air freshener. Outside the window stretched gray fields, sparse houses, trees. The road felt longer than before because he was with himself, without his usual distractions. His mother's apartment smelled of soup, old books, and her hand cream. In the kitchen, a lamp with a shade cast a soft circle of light onto the table. She set a plate in front of him, adjusted the towel on the back of a chair, like always, as if care lives in small things. "You've lost weight," she said. He wanted to argue, but didn't. He just nodded. "Listen," she said after a while, not looking straight at him. "I'm not prying, but you always seem far away." He felt his usual defense rise. "I'm fine." But this time it didn't work. He looked at her hands, small cracks, age spots, and thought, "She's alone too. She's holding on too." "I'm really not okay," he said quietly. She didn't gasp, didn't make a scene. She simply slid her hand closer across the table, as if closing distance. "I know," she said. "I've known for a long time. I was just waiting for you to say it yourself." Those words hurt and eased him at the same time. He suddenly realized he'd spent his whole life trying to prove to her he could handle it, and all that time she hadn't demanded proof. She'd just been waiting for him. That evening, they looked through old photos. The paper rustled and smelled of time. In one photo, he was a teenager by a river, hair tousled by wind, smile real. His mother said, "You used to be able to sit for hours just staring at the water, and you felt good." He looked at the picture and felt something warm click in his chest, like a bulb turning on. "I forgot I'm allowed to do that," he said. His mother shrugged. "Then remember." It wasn't advice, it was permission. After that trip, he returned to the city different, not cured, but a little more alive. He started walking home not by the usual route, but another one, to pass through the park. The park smelled of wet bark and smoke. Someone was roasting chestnuts somewhere. He stopped and watched people. Someone walking a dog, someone arguing on the phone, someone simply sitting on a bench staring at the snow. Life wasn't beautiful, it was various, and that was comforting. He didn't have to look beautiful to have the right to live. At the next session, he said to the therapist, "I think I was always afraid to admit I needed help, because if I admitted it, it would mean I'm weak." The therapist asked, "Who told you that help is weakness?" He thought. Praise from friends, expectations, the way he'd been praised for self-sufficiency floated up. He suddenly understood. His strength was convenient for other people. Strong people didn't require extra questions. He didn't blame anyone. He simply saw the mechanism for the first time. Time passed. He learned to live not in a leap, but in steps. He learned to notice when that business-like voice rose inside him and answer it not with commands, but with care. Sometimes he said to himself directly, "You're scared right now. It's okay." The words sounded strange, but they worked. He started sleeping a little better, not always, but more often. He started eating with appetite, not by schedule. He began seeing friends not because you should, but because sometimes he wanted to. And if he didn't, he stayed home without inventing excuses. At first, he feared his friends would turn away, but more often they simply said, "Okay, see you later." Again, the world didn't fall apart. One day at work, the same manager came up to him by the coffee machine. "How are you now?" he asked. And again, the habitual "fine" rose up. He caught it mid-flight. "Better than it was," he said. "Not perfect, but better." The manager nodded, as if that was the most normal answer in the world. "Glad to hear it, and if anything, say it earlier. Don't take it to the edge." He returned to his desk and suddenly felt gratitude in his chest. Not excitement, not joy, but quiet warmth for being not punished for truth. One evening, he sat by the window again with a mug. Outside, snow was falling. Streetlights made it soft and golden. The apartment was quiet. He could hear a tram far away, someone in the building closing a window. He thought about the person he'd buried and suddenly understood. Death had reminded him not only of an end, but that life has taste while it exists. He didn't find all the answers. He didn't become a different person in a couple of months. He still sometimes slipped into autopilot, still feared being hit again. But now he knew. There was at least one person he could text. There was a place he could go and tell the truth. There was a mother who had long been waiting not for his success, but for his presence. And most importantly, he began to feel moments when a quiet "I want" appeared inside him. I want to take a walk. I want soup. I want light in the hallway. I want not to pretend. Those wants were small, but life is built from small things. That night he turned off the light, lay down, and silence came again. But it wasn't empty anymore. There was room in it for breath, for memory, for tomorrow morning, which promised no miracles, but promised continuation. A month after the first attack, another fear arrived, quiet, almost rational. What if he'd made it up? What if it was just a whim, fatigue, weakness of character? What if he was inflating a problem because no real tragedy had happened, nothing he could present as justification? He caught himself comparing. Someone had war, someone illness, someone the loss of loved ones, and he had an office, an apartment, friends, and still emptiness. That made him even more ashamed. One day the therapist told him, "Pain doesn't have to be earned." At first, he rejected it as a pretty line. Then he noticed it surfaced when he tried to belittle himself again. And each time it worked not as a slogan, but as a small stop sign. Stop. Don't hit yourself. He began doing one strange thing, setting reminders in his phone not for tasks, but for himself. Eat, go outside, drink water. At first it felt humiliating, as if he were a child who needed control. Then he understood it wasn't control, but care, like putting a glass of water on the table because you know you'll forget. At work once there was a crunch, an urgent project, tightened deadlines, everyone limping around with coffee cups like crutches. He felt the old excitement again, the familiar adrenaline he was always good with. He took tasks, replied quickly, closed issues. Inside rose the familiar sensation, this is where he's needed. And with it, danger. He was disappearing into functionality again. On the third day of the crunch, he stood by the printer waiting for pages and suddenly realized he couldn't feel his legs. Not numbness, presence. His body had become a tool he dragged along. He looked at the sheets, at black letters, and the letters suddenly looked meaningless. For a second, it hit him. This could be endless, and he might never show up inside it. He stepped aside to the window. Outside it was evening, snow lit by headlights, people hurrying home. He placed his palms on the cold glass. The cold brought him back into his body. He took a few slow breaths, and for the first time in years said to himself, "I don't have to save everything." He went to the project lead and said briefly, "I'm overloaded. I need an hour without tasks or I'm going to break." The lead looked surprised, then nodded. "Okay, take a pause. Just tell the chat you're offline." He typed offline for an hour. And again, the world didn't collapse. He sat alone in a meeting room, turned the lights off, leaving only a lamp in the corner. The warm pool of light on the table felt almost like home. He sat and listened to voices somewhere behind the wall, the hum of the AC. He felt tiredness, not toxic, but normal, the tiredness of a living person. That evening he met his friend again. They didn't go to a bar, they just got coffee to go and walked down the street. Snow crunched, the air smelled of smoke. The friend suddenly asked, "Do you remember the last time we just went for a walk?" He thought. There were meetups, hangouts, events. Just a walk wasn't there. "I don't," he said. "Well then," the friend replied, "let's count this as a start." They reached a bridge and stopped. Below, dark water flowed with bits of ice drifting on the surface. He watched the water and suddenly felt a desire, quiet, awkward. "I want to go somewhere for the weekend, alone, not to run away, but to be." The friend didn't laugh, didn't say, "Come with us." He just nodded. "Go, and tell me afterward if you want." That weekend he really went, not far, just to a small town where you can walk and be unknown. He rented a small room that smelled of clean linens and wood. In the evening he went out, walked across an empty square. The streetlights glowed softly, and in that light the snow looked almost warm. He bought a pastry from a 24-hour kiosk, ate it as he walked, and suddenly realized he could taste it. Hot dough, sweet filling, grease on his fingers. He laughed, quietly, to himself. It wasn't celebration, it was return. He woke at night anyway, the old mechanism fired. Darkness, silence, the thought of emptiness. But now his phone lay nearby, and inside it was his list of small truths. He opened the notes and read, "I'm lonely. I'm tired of pretending. I need light." He closed the phone and did something he hadn't done before. He placed a hand on his chest, felt his own breathing, and simply whispered, "I'm here." The words sounded strange, but his body relaxed for a second. When he came back to the city, nothing became perfect. He was still confused about himself. He still sometimes answered fine by inertia. But now he could catch the moment and sometimes correct it. Actually, not great. And each time something inside became a little more honest, a little lighter. In spring, he went back to the cemetery again, alone. The snow was gone, the earth was dark, smelling of wet grass. He brought a small bouquet, set it down, and stood there silently. The wind moved the branches. Somewhere a woodpecker tapped. He thought that person was gone, but had left him something important, a shove. Death reminded him of life. He didn't thank death, he simply acknowledged the fact. Sometimes only loss breaks through the wall. As he left, he caught himself wanting to call his friend, not because he felt bad, but because he wanted to share. He dialed. "Hey," he said, "I was there, and I'm okay right now, for real." There was a pause, then his friend smiled through his voice. "I'm glad you can hear that." That evening he came home, turned on the light, put the kettle on, and sat by the window. Outside, a warm spring rain fell. The air smelled of wet earth. He felt tiredness and calm at once. Not happiness, not an answer, just continuation. And in that continuation, for the first time in a long time, he could see himself. In summer, it became easier to notice life, not because he was cured, but because the city itself offered light. In the morning, sunlight fell in stripes across the kitchen table, and the dust in those stripes was so distinct it almost looked beautiful. He stopped getting angry at dust. Before, it would have irritated him, another thing to control. Now he sometimes just watched the particles drift slowly in the air and thought, the world isn't perfect and nothing terrible happens. He started arriving at work a little later but calmer. A couple of times he even allowed himself not to answer messages right away, without explaining. At first, it made him anxious. What if they think he's letting himself go, getting worse? Then he noticed no one watched him as closely as he did. The internal warden lived in his head, not in the office. One day in the office kitchen, he saw an intern standing at the coffee machine, staring at the buttons in confusion. The guy was very young, nervous, his hands shaking. He asked quietly, "How do you make a cappuccino here?" He could have walked past, but he stopped, showed him, pressed the right buttons, waited for the milk to hiss. "Thanks," the intern said, smiling too wide, as if gratitude was also a way to survive. He went back to his desk and suddenly felt a strange softness. Not pride, not importance, just a human connection. He helped someone, and that was simply that. Closer to autumn, another setback came, quiet, cunning. He accumulated fatigue, skipped therapy for 2 weeks because too much to do, started staying late again, eating stress again, turning the TV on for background again. Autopilot hadn't vanished, it had been waiting to be invited back. One evening he came home and suddenly realized he didn't remember what he'd been thinking about on the way, as if the day had been erased. The sensation scared him. He sat in the kitchen, turned on the light, and the old formula surfaced. Everyone thinks you're fine. He wanted to return to it, to hide, and at the same time, he already knew the price of that shelter. He texted the therapist and asked for the nearest appointment. Then he texted his friend, "Can we grab coffee tomorrow?" He sent it and felt relief, as if he'd lifted his head out of water. In the session, he said, "I'm afraid I'll get lost again." The therapist asked, "What do you do when you feel yourself getting lost?" He thought. Before, he would have answered, "Work more." Now the answers were different. "I write, I go outside, I tell my friend, I visit my mom." The therapist nodded. "Then you already know how to come back." It was a simple thought, but it settled inside him like support. Not permanent, not concrete, more like warm wood you can lean on when it sways. That evening he met his friend. They sat on a bench by his building, drinking tea from paper cups. The night was warm, nearby trees rustled. The friend said, "You know, you've changed." He tensed, bracing for an evaluation. "In what way?" "You've become real," his friend said. "Before you were like a storefront, beautiful, but you can't touch it. Now you can be near you." He was silent because the words stuck in his throat. Then he said, "I was afraid if I showed I was struggling, you'd leave. And we were afraid if we asked, you'd push us away," the friend replied. They sat a little longer in silence. He listened to the cup lid rattle in the wind, to someone laughing somewhere in the courtyard, and he suddenly understood loneliness isn't always from a lack of people. Sometimes it's from a lack of truth. Later, he went upstairs without turning on the TV, undressed, washed his hands, felt the smell of soap and warm water. He opened the window for a minute. The air was cool, smelling of wet leaves. He stood there breathing, and in that simple scene there was more life than in hundreds of his perfect days. He lay down to sleep and thought not about what he had to do tomorrow, but about what he might feel tomorrow. Maybe it would be hard, maybe it would be fine. But now the word fine wasn't a lid, it was one option. In the morning he would wake up, turn off the alarm, take a shower, make coffee. The world would be the same, but there would be one small difference in him. He would know that if it got dark, he could turn on the light and ask for it out loud. Almost a year had passed since that email. Not a round date, not an anniversary. Simply he noticed one day that the calendar had flipped and he was still here. He hadn't become stronger in the usual sense. He had become gentler with himself. That turned out to be harder than keeping his face composed. In October, the city smelled of wet leaves and cold stone. He found himself on the subway again at rush hour. The car was packed, people pressed close, strangers' sleeves brushing his shoulder. Before, in that crowding, he would vanish inside himself, become a smooth surface so nothing would snag. Now he tried something else, staying. He held the pole and looked at faces. Tired, irritated, distracted. A woman carefully adjusted a child's hat. Her fingers moved with habitual care. A man across the aisle read messages and frowned, then suddenly sighed and put the phone away as if tired of himself. A girl in headphones gently nodded to the beat, and that barely visible rhythm soothed him. He felt these people were not scenery. They were living just as complexly, just as unevenly, and that made it a little easier. He wasn't the only one holding on. At the next stop, an elderly person with a cane got on. The crowd shifted a little, then froze again. No one moved. He, unexpectedly to himself, stood up and offered the seat. It was a simple act, but as he stood there holding the pole, he realized he didn't do it to look good. He did it because he felt another person, which meant he could feel again. That evening, he met his friend for 10 minutes, literally 10. They stood by the entrance, drank coffee from paper cups, steam rising in the cold air. "How are you?" the friend asked. He thought and answered without heroism. "It varies, but I'm not alone with it anymore." The friend nodded as if he heard what mattered and didn't push the topic. They talked about nonsense. A new film, how the courtyard still hadn't had its leaves cleared. That was support too, being able not to explain everything so you wouldn't be abandoned. Later, he called his mother. They talked about small things. Her faucet broke, cheap apples had appeared at the market. At one point she asked, "How are you today?" He smiled, and the smile wasn't forced. "Today, it's calm," he said. "Not perfect, but calm." "That's good," she replied, and added, "I'm glad you're not alone." He didn't argue that he was still often alone. He understood not alone wasn't about how many people were nearby. It was about being able to call. He hung up, put the kettle on, opened the window for a couple of minutes. Cold air entered the room, bringing the smell of rain and wet leaves. He closed the window, sat at the table, and looked at his hands. Ordinary hands, no heroism. He thought answers might never come. Some things inside him might remain: his tendency to retreat into silence, the fear of being unnecessary, the habit of holding himself together. But alongside that was something else now: the experience of returning. He turned off the light and lay down. In the dark, he could hear someone behind the wall talking quietly, the elevator working somewhere. The city lived, and he lived with it. Simply onward. Sometimes, already almost used to the fact that he could ask for help, he caught an old urge to become easy again, to be the one who doesn't cause trouble. The urge came in small things. He wanted to apologize when he wasn't at fault, wanted to over-explain, wanted to smile so no one asked too much. He learned to notice the impulse and not follow it automatically. On one ordinary weekday, he stayed at work late. Not because it was an emergency, just how it happened. The office emptied, corridor lights dimmed, the AC sounded louder than during the day. He packed up, stepped outside, and saw the first snow, large, sparse flakes falling slowly, as if testing whether winter was allowed to begin. He walked home instead of calling a taxi. Snow landed on his sleeves, melted, left dark dots. The air smelled cold and clean. He noticed his steps had slowed. Before, he always hurried. Hurry was a way not to be alone with himself. Now he let himself walk and simply look. A bakery window glowed. Inside, a man in an apron pulled a tray from the oven, and for a second the door released the smell of warm dough. He stopped, bought a bun, walked on eating it, feeling crumbs on his fingers. It was insignificant and yet important. He allowed himself a small pleasure without a reason. At home, he took off his shoes, hung up his coat, turned on a lamp instead of the overhead light. The room softened immediately. He put the kettle on, poured water, sat in the kitchen, and opened his list of notes. He added one more sentence: "I can live slowly." Then he smiled to himself, not because everything was good, but because he recognized himself in that sentence. The next week, he went back to therapy. He wasn't expecting miracles anymore. He came so he wouldn't lose direction. Sometimes he talked a lot, sometimes he was silent, sometimes he left feeling nothing had changed, and sometimes with the quiet understanding that change isn't bright, it accumulates. And still, there were days when he felt empty again. He didn't romanticize it, didn't make a story out of it. He simply noted, today is like that, and he did what he knew. Ate, drank water, went outside, wrote his friend, called his mother. Sometimes it was enough, sometimes it wasn't. But even when it wasn't, he no longer stayed alone inside his silence. He never received a final answer for why it happened, and maybe he never would, but he found something else, a way to stay close to himself without demanding immediate repair, a way to live not perfectly, but honestly. And honesty turned out to be warmer than control. At some point, he noticed he was no longer as afraid of silence. Silence could still be heavy, but details had appeared in it now. The ticking of a clock, the whisper of curtains, his own breathing. Sometimes he left his phone in another room and read a paper book, feeling the roughness of the pages under his fingers. He could stop mid-paragraph and just look out the window without scolding himself for wasting time. One day, his friend texted, "I'm not okay today." Before, he would have been frightened of someone else's pain, not knowing what to say. Now he replied simply, "Do you want me to come over and we can just sit?" And he went. They sat in the friend's kitchen, drank tea, stayed quiet, and he understood another thing. Support isn't words, it's presence, and sometimes he can be the one who's there. Walking home late at night, he moved down an empty street and felt tiredness in his legs. A low, dark sky hung over the city. Far away, windows flickered. He thought, yes, life will still bring pain. Yes, sometimes he will retreat into himself again. But now he has a path back, and that is enough to keep going. He didn't promise himself happiness. He promised himself honesty, to notice, to speak, to breathe, and then to take the next step day after day without rushing. Thank you for being here. This was Rise and Remind.